everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the second session of the second day of our webinar on sustainable finance. This session, we are, quickly on the name of the conference, oiConference. The oi comes from the fact that we are supported by a student organization called Oikos International, and they are kind of branding their student-led conferences like this. Stephen and I are both students focusing, at least in part, on sustainability and finance. And this session specifically will be led by Colby, who is the vice president of the Harvard Extension School Environmental Club. That's the second organization who is also supporting us in this endeavor. I will say another few words about him in a moment. But first, I would like to ask Stephen to put up the poll so that we can know a little bit about where people are from, what you know about the topic, and you can, the topic of this session is society, race, and the environment. Colby will give a bit more of an intro also to the speakers. So a quick word about Colby. He is pursuing his ALB degree at Harvard Extension School in government with a minor in environmental studies. As I said, he's the current vice president of the Harvard Extension School Environmental Club, and he has most recently worked with the Massachusetts Climate Action Network in their research on regional municipal light plants. And there is one more info about the Q&A later in this session. We are using an extra app that Stephen will also be posting the link to in a moment. It's where you can put in your questions and you can vote other people's questions up if you like them, so that in the end, Colby will be able to source from the most appreciated, most interesting questions that you as the participants found most interesting. And with that, I'll hand it over to Colby, who's moderating this session. Thank you, Colby.
All right, yeah, so thank you very much, Oliver, for that great introduction. So yeah, the focus of this, sorry, just getting my things in order here. The focus of this session is going to be on society, race, and environment. And we're going to be talking with three really wonderful people who work in this very diverse and broad nexus that we're covering here. So we're going to be talking first to Mariana Martin-Leys, an animal lawyer and climate reality leader, and works with the Climate Reality Project. Next, we'll be hearing from Loretta Brady, who is the director of Requity labs at St. Anselm College, where she also is a professor. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Liz Salas Evans, who's the president and chief compliance officer of the Cayena capital management firm. And yeah, so I'll also give each of these speakers a chance to go pretty deep into their own work, and each of them have a short presentation, about 5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll be reserving the last half of this for Q&A, kind of talk backs, and then we have a couple topics that the speakers have brought up to me beforehand of things that would be good to kick off that conversation. So I'll hand it now over to Mariana, who's going to start us off.
Okay. Hello, Colby. Hello, everybody. Hi, my name is Mariana Martin-Leys, and I am very thankful and privileged to be a part of this wonderful conference on sustainable finance. I will be focusing specifically on biodiversity and ecosystem sustainable finance. Okay, so just a quick overview. It's a very, very broad topic, so we're trying to compact it to a short presentation. First of all, when we talk about financial service, about sustainable finance, we're talking about any financial service that integrates the ESG or environmental, social, and governance criteria into the business or investment decisions. So why would we put the financial sector at the service of our planet. Well, the main reason to do that is because climate change impact threatens financial stability and leads to major economic losses that we've already been seeing over the last recent years, that they are just growing and growing. So there are many sustainable finance activities. Some of them are social responsible investments, or SRIs. And there's a big list like sustainable funds, green finance, impact investment. And then we come to what is biodiversity and ecosystem sustainable finance, which is my topic of today. So first of all, when we talk of biodiversity, what are we talking about? We're talking about biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth of all living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the habitats and ecological complexes that they are a part of. So these living organisms, like animals, like plants, like fungi, even microorganisms, like bacteria that make up our natural world, they work together in ecosystems, which at the same time interact as a system in conjunction with the non-living components of their environment. So biodiversity and ecosystems provide humanity. Why are they important? Because they provide us with a range of invaluable benefits, like essential life support functions and services that we need to survive. For instance, food, clean air, fresh water, medicine, shelter, genetic resources, flood protection, nutrient cycling, climate regulation. And at the same time, these services are essential for our human health, for human well-being, for security, and what the topic of today is, which is economic growth in a sustainable manner.
Hey, Mariana.
So, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Your slides aren't showing. I'm not sure if you had started screen sharing or if you wanted to.
Oh, I thought they were sharing. You don't see them?
I do not.
Oh. So
sorry.
Oh.
I think you'll have to just press it again, Mariana. So if you do the share process one more time.
There, you have it now? You weren't seeing them since the beginning?
No. So the share screen button on that bottom banner in the center there.
Wait. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. Do you see that now?
Yes, yeah, we have them now.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna go slowly just through the ones I already presented because the slides are important. Okay. Okay. Are you seeing them now? Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so there has been a huge concern worldwide in recent years because biodiversity loss has been growing at a humongous rate. We are practically facing a sixth mass extinction. And if we look at the numbers, since 1970, the world has lost 60% of its global vertebrate population, more than 40% of its insect species. Natural forests declined by 6.5 million hectares per year between 2010 and 2015. We have lost 20% of the mangroves. Our natural wetlands have declined by 35%, and I could go on and on. We even, there are huge numbers of loss, and the projections towards the future are we can even lose 99% of our coral reefs. So we have to do something about it. And there has been huge concern, and in response to that global anxiety that has been presented, and the thought that the international community is probably not making enough effort to end this or to halt it, In 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, was created through three main objectives, which are conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable share of its benefits. And then in 2010, the Conference of the Parties, COP, in Nagoya, decided to invite all the parties to submit information concerning innovative financial mechanisms to contribute to the solution of biodiversity loss and generate new financial resources. So that is where we come to the topic of biodiversity finance. Biodiversity finance is the practice of raising and managing capital and using financial incentives to support biodiversity management. So this includes private and public financial resources, investments in commercial activities, and the value of the transactions in biodiversity-related markets. So what we see here is that there is already, it is a growing activity, but there is still a lot more that can be done and needs to be done if we want to continue existing as a species and enjoying this wonderful planet that we have. We have a huge gap between the global needs of financial resources, which can be from $150 billion to $450 billion. And then our current annual global biodiversity funding is around $52 billion. So there's a lot to be done. So this is why biodiversity sustainable finance is so important, because by investing in biodiversity, we are investing in sustainable development, which also it contributes directly to poverty reduction, to economic sustainability, and to the full range of the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, which are the sustainable development goals. So where do these sources come from? The CBD classified 6 innovative financial mechanisms, which are environmental fiscal reforms through taxes and charges on natural resource use, on pesticides, on fertilizers, on subsidies that are harmful for the environment, also through payment for ecosystem services, through incentives, biodiversity offset to mitigate, restore, and offset, and markets for green products, also like ecotourism and biotrade, timber from reduced impact logging, and then biodiversity and climate change funding through the reduction of emissions from deforestation, biodegradable detergents, sustainable soy and sugar, and finally, biodiversity and international development finance through ODAs.
Hey, Mariana, I'm sorry to cut in again. You're just about at time, so maybe take about 30 more seconds to just to
okay. So
give us some concluding thoughts here.
I just wanted to quickly say that also other financial mechanisms are biodiversity relevant bonds and funds that we can find in the market. The stakeholders are the public sector, private sector, governments, NGOs, indigenous peoples, and local communities. And that the final message is that there is a lot done, but there's a lot more to be done. And we all need to contribute as individuals and as a collective to protect our planet, which is our home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. That was so insightful. All right, so next up, we're gonna be hearing from Loretta.
Am I unmuted?
You are, yeah.
Okay,
and
sorry, that's what I was looking for. Thank you. Mariana, that was a really great presentation. Your slides were amazingly beautiful. I'm so jealous of that, and also so densely informative. I hope those slides are available after, because I definitely want to spend more time looking at those details you put together.
Thank you, Loretta.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I am a clinical psychologist. That's my discipline, my training. I've been doing capacity building work for organizations for more than 20 years. So this past year, I've been on an academic sabbatical, so I haven't been teaching. I didn't have to suddenly learn how to teach new. But I have been working very much on kind of consolidating a lot of the work that I've contributed to and really launching my lab in earnest. So Requity Labs has come out of that. And I apologize. I am, let's see if I can advance through these slides here. Yeah, this right here, if you hear background noise, this is why. Love those humans and little pet there. But we're all quarantined together here, so it's super fun. And also an explanation for why some of the visuals in my slides today aren't going to be as high quality, because homeschooling 5 children across 3 schools and 5 grades is actually not possible, it turns out. So with all that being said, just to give you a sense of what I do at the college, I teach organizational psychology, I teach cross-cultural psychology. And the reason I do that work is because even though my training is as a clinician and I'm a master addiction counselor as well, what I've learned in working with the most vulnerable populations, including prisoners, including immigrants, refugees, including veterans, including patients with chronic pain, is that oppression is trauma. And oppression can come in many forms. It can come in the forms of denigrating biodiversity, as Mariana was very eloquently laying out for us. It can come from social exclusion and obviously violence, gendered violence, class violence, political violence. And once you work closely in trying to create change for individual vulnerable people, you learn how connected everything is and how systemic the barriers that they are navigating truly are. And so you become very, if you're like me, you become very motivated to have even larger systemic impact. And as you navigate that systemic impact, as you navigate some of those efforts, you learn that every idea has an origin point, and those ideas lay the groundwork for the change that becomes possible after that. So this is just one example of some of the learning I do in my course, Organizational Psychology, with my students at the college. Do a lot of project-based learning, and each of the projects are multiply impactful as far as the concepts covered, as well as the growth I'm looking to see in my students. At my lab, this is how we work. We develop leadership accountability through coaching. We measure and assess climate and culture within organizations. We create curriculum as well as strategic plans for organizations and teams. We engage community asset mapping as a way of bolstering the local accountability and impact that organizations can have, and hopefully link them in really meaningful ways to the global work of resilience and restoration. So one of the things that we've long done is bring people together in ways that are accessible. So trying to do low cost or no cost events to draw in more marginalized, lower income individuals, or allow individuals who do have income and wealth to direct that in a way that makes sense for their values. This past February, before things suddenly shifted in our region here in the United States, we launched our first Requity Labs branded public event called Love Your Life, where we brought in a speaker, Dottie Graham, who is a public defender, is now a federal public defender and worked for many years in our state as a public defender, and had been nominated for a judgeship that had been blocked by now our governor, then an executive counselor. And it was a very public, partisan blocking. And so it was wonderful to have her in a few years after that experience to hear lessons that she learned about resilience that she shared with her family and then with our group that was able to attend. And you'll see on this slide a number of organizations, and you'll see New Hampshire Black Women for Health and NAACP. And the reason for that is because, well, the NAACP was a sponsor of this event, but the New Hampshire Black Women Health Project and another organization, we were very intentional in planning that event and wanting to bring in local marginalized community groups to elevate their profile around individuals who might be motivated to support their mission as well. So here's an example of institutional power that I have, because I have a beautiful campus and beautiful facilities and a large network, and how I could leverage that for the service of a less well-supported organization that has deep impact in our local community. And I just give that as a little micro case for some of the larger lessons that we'll be talking about today. The programs that we have developed over the time focus on micro and macro. So you see here a poster for our Culturally Effective Leadership Program. This is organizational development work that I do, where cohorts of leaders are brought together and they assess themselves, they assess their organizational readiness for change. They then learn about what it means to be culturally effective, what it means to be anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-classist. And then they engage in self-directed learning as well as self-directed change over a series of 6 months that contribute to both their own increased knowledge of why it's so hard to do this work, what does implicit bias mean, and how does that even impact what we're doing at the organizational level. But then they also get some traction organizationally as well within their systems. The other poster you might be seeing, depending on where your gallery view is set up, is the Thrive Accelerator program. And this is a personal development program that allows an individual to kind of think of their own 5-year personal strategic plan relative to the commitments that they have in their life, whether that be parenting, caring for elders, or community projects that align with their values, but that they have to juggle against professional commitments as well. So, you know, why have a clinical psychologist who focuses on race and equity and focuses on human resilience at an environmental justice panel, right? Maybe you're asking these questions. I don't have any particular finance service knowledge, but the reason is that resilience is central to sustainability, and we can think about resilience from a supply chain point of view. We can think about resilience from an ecosystem point of view, but we also recognize that without human resilience, we don't have sustainability, right? Because the less resilient any community is, the more vulnerable those community members are to making choices that are not sustainable, either for themselves individually, you know, drinking, drugging, all those things that we know can be harmful, but also for themselves socially, within their family units or within the broader social and political field. So the ability to bounce back after adversity, but the ability to do so in ways that are generative and restorative is really central to the work that I try to engage and to the work of resilience and equity.
Loretta, we're sorry, just about at time there. If you want to take about 30 seconds to.
So the way that I think about this work, and we'll be able to get into this in the next segment, is that if we take a trauma-informed approach where we understand that oppression is trauma and we understand that human development has certain requirements for it to be able to make the best decisions, then we understand that our key technique in social equity is actually bolstering the empowerment of the least powerful groups within a social system, and doing so in a way that provides for those basic human needs that make energy expense possible. And I will just end with power and control. This is a key aspect here. This comes out of Marcus and Connor's 2014 book called Clash: How to Thrive in a Multicultural World. She's a UC Berkeley psychologist, I believe. So she created this lovely visual in this book called The Culture Cycle, where ideas are born and they create institutions. Those institutions shape the interactions that are possible, and those interactions shape the individuals. And as you can see here, that's a replicative and multi-directional cycle. And the point here is just that our financial services and our global economic system is an idea, and it creates institutions, and those institutions dictate interactions, and those interactions can in fact be influenced by individual people, but those interactions also shape the destinies and the attitudes of individual people who, again, going back to that cycle, create those ideas. And so I think those are the opportunities and the moments for power exchange that are worth digging into in this broader conversation. And with that, I'll say thank you. And I think I stopped sharing my screen now.
Looks like it's still sharing, but that's okay. Thank you, Loretta. That was, one right after another. Great presentations here. I'm really moving forward. So we're going to hear from Liz next. And feel free to just jump on in and share your slides there, Liz.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. All right. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So my presentation today is on policy, Wall Street, and inclusion. And so this really describes the many roles that I currently am doing, as well as kind of the industries that I'm spread across. So I'm the President and Chief Compliance Officer of Cayena Capital Management, a registered investment firm. And also I hold my master's in applied economics, which I utilize the skills to, of course, develop relationships and identify really the lack of access within communities. And so that role is a project coordinator that I work with in the Manchester Inclusivity and Equity Committee that focuses on garnering relationships with marginalized communities within Manchester. And I'm also a visiting scholar at the Morgan Franklin Fellowship Foundation in New Hampshire, which focuses on financial literacy. So I help to create content and curriculum for fundamentals of investing, as well as just cultivate relationships in the community for individuals that, of course, are in need of financial literacy or would find beneficial this information, which I hope is really everyone. So my presentation today is really going to tie in these three areas of my personal and professional experience. I've spent 15 years on Wall Street, working with the large investment firms in the world, Charles Schwab, Fidelity Investments, and then subsidiaries that are owned by these companies. And so really the opacity behind the industry, and as we've talked about, really the environments that are created. So with that said, in my graduate studies in economics, it really drove me to really focus on two individuals, particularly two economists. So Dr. Phyllis Wallace, she graduated with her doctorate in economics in 1948. She then went ahead and she joined the EEOC and the National Bureau of Economic Research to really start consulting and developing really opportunities and structure given the civil rights movement in 1964, which, in the 60s, and so that really was what gave birth to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So through her work, she focused on discrimination, she focused on minorities. As a Black woman, getting her doctorate in 1948. So with that said, her work really focused on the lack of accountability for our institutions. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that is the governing body within the United States that holds private institutions accountable for discrimination against race, sex, color, national origin. So with that said, Dr. Gary S. Becker, he went to the University of Chicago. He graduated with his doctorate in 1955, and his dissertation was on the economics of discrimination. So he developed the role and the mindset that discrimination of taste. So that is something that became really popular and is implemented today, along with, of course, Milton Friedman, who developed in terms of the finance side, the modern finance theory, modern portfolio theory. And so with that said, the world government, federal government loved the discrimination of taste model because it said, well, if you don't want to work with Black and brown people, that's fine. You can hire and pay a premium for white people. But if Black and brown people, if you want to work with us in this environment, and if we have to look at you, well then we're going to pay you less. And so with that being said, that became the model of, okay, well, if we have to tolerate Black and brown people in our society, well, then they have to be used to being paid less because we're the ones that have to, deal with you. So discrimination of taste. So with that being said, Dr. Wallace, 1948, consulting, saying, yeah, no, there's really no way, in economics to really have the best talent if you discriminate against subsets of population. So with that said, in 1970, she began to collect data on AT&T. So they started to see an increase in claims. So again, the EEOC is there for private organizations. So with that said, in 1970, the commission received more than 1,500 charges against AT&T, which represented 7% of the EEOC's workload. Okay, so in 1 year, 1,500 against one company. So with that said, I just did the math here, they didn't have the historical data that was out there released to confirm what the annual complaints were. But just, assuming 1,500 being 7%, that would bring to about 21,000 total complaints for 1970. And so I started thinking, okay, well, if we have the EEOC that focuses on private institutions, well, then who covers government? And so they have their own internal review process that isn't even, it doesn't allow for employees of public agencies to even file a complaint. So I pulled 2018. I can go ahead and share the link for all of the years, but 2018 saw charges of 76,418. So we see that these numbers are clearly multiplying and compounding throughout the years. Race and color made up 27,766. So one thing that's important to mention is that with this governing body of all private institutions that we see publicly traded on Wall Street, that the only way to really elevate and really say, hey, I'm being discriminated against is go through this avenue. They don't even define color discrimination because you can say, there's no defining factor. There's also, in terms of multiracial individuals that have Afro, Latino descent of myself or African ancestry that maybe identify with different cultural backgrounds and ethnicities. There's also a lack of definition between race between the Hispanic community, where they say Hispanic as a race and the US Census does not recognize that as a race. So moving on in terms of Wall Street and investments, as Mariana had stated and Loretta, as well as the ESG and this focus on social governance. So looking at the growth of assets that have gone into social governance. And so you may say, well, how does this tie into the EEOC? And how does this tie into these funds, right, that are saying they're going to be socially responsible? And so that does because of the fact that most of these companies that are publicly traded that are used to build these investments as ESG funds are also governed by the EEOC. So with that being said, they're not forced to disclose the number of complaints that they've received internally, nor are they responsible to disclose the number of attempts to file complaints. So what I've also seen is with the surge of complaints that we saw in the prior slide of 76,000 and the surge of funds going to ESG funds, well, why aren't we just requiring companies to disclose? And so then again, if we're seeing a rise of funds to ESG, we're seeing a rise in complaints, well, that just shows that the ESG is really greenwashing. Because obviously, if it's only following private organizations, you would see a decline in discrimination complaints, and then you would see an increase of ESG funds showing that there is a response. So that led me to look at regulation. What regulations are out there? So the Freedom Financing Act is a bill that refuses banking institutions from being able to discriminate against any company for reputational considerations. And so that does sound good, right? But how does that come into play for ESG? Well, if you're JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, if you're Larry Fink at BlackRock, and you have somebody who's a gun manufacturer and you say, you know what, I'm not gonna offer you a loan because I don't believe that we should be manufacturing AK-47. Well, the Freedom Financing Act says, no, you can't do that. You cannot say that you're not going to give this institution money to go ahead and manufacture AK-47s, because based on this law, it prevents you from doing that. So based on this law, it also questions the ESG funds that are put out there. Secondly, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commissions, who I'm a small investment advisor, so I'm not governed by them yet, but hopefully someday. But traditionally, you know, they look at the standard of companies need to be focused on providing material disclosure on reasonable investor needs to make informed investment decisions and voting decisions based on the company's particular facts and circumstances. So the facts and circumstances is that companies are there to make a profit. Companies are there to maximize profits. And so if we don't start looking at the way that their operations are working, so are they spending their operational money to fight claims? Are they suppressing individuals within their organization and saying that they're just not a good fit, so they leave when they really should have stayed and promoted them, or whatever it is? You know, are they seeing high turnover rates? So third, the Department of Labor in April 2018, they reiterated in terms of investment management that in terms of the investment necessarily causes a plan to forego other investment opportunities, plan fiduciaries, myself included, are not permitted to sacrifice investment return or take any additional investment risk as a means of using plan investments to promote collateral social policy goals. What that means is that if somebody comes to me and says, oh, you know, I of course want to save all the ocelots that are in the Mexican Amazon, and you know, is there a way for you to do that? I can say, yeah, I can take that into consideration. However, the regulators tell me that I have to make sure that I maximize profits and ensure that I'm making the best investment decisions based on numbers and not objective.
Hey Liz, so we're just about at time. If you want to have about 30 seconds to a minute to.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes. And so this brings me to my last final slides, actually. So investment objectives, looking at investment objectives, I looked at SHE, which is an index fund by State Street. No other reason other than the symbol. So they look to diversify in companies that are led by women, or looking at that, you know, again, SHE, the symbol. So based on the top holdings as of last night, as published on State Street's website, not one company listed in their top holdings is led by a woman or person of color. And so with that also said, this fund charges 2 times more than the index fund SPY, which is just a standard index. So lastly, my questions and final thoughts: should government require companies to report turnover rates between races? Should companies be required to also report all human resources complaints regarding discrimination? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That, wow, what a heavy question, a burden to leave us on. These were all really great presentations. And we are going to be transitioning now into the Q&A and discussion section. So we had gotten like a few topics to kind of kick us off here. And I think especially based on that last slide that you just put up, Liz, one question that I have is, you know, for whom does the moral burden fall on for sustainable development? Like, should we be looking more towards the private sector and companies, or to government and policymakers to be the leaders on this? And I'm directing this kind of at Liz, but I want to open it up to the entire panel as well, to feel free to talk about this.
Yeah, I feel that, of course, companies can have their own objectives, but you can't start a company unless you get approved by your local, state, or federal government to do business in that area. So it needs to come from government. And so I referenced South Africa and the apartheid that happened, where they came out of this with creating what's called as the broad-based Black economic empowerment certificate. Not effective, but they did something where they require all companies to fill out this certificate annually to identify what are they doing for upward mobility and inclusion for minorities and Black citizens in South Africa. Where it's not effective is that it's voluntary. You're required to do it the first time, but then it becomes voluntary following, and then there's all these other exemptions. So yeah, I think it needs to come from policy. I mean, policy, governments are what allow you to do business in your area anyways.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just jump into that, you know, thinking about that culture cycle, ideas, institutions, interactions, and individuals, and recognizing that, and going back to, I think, Kish's presentation this morning when we kicked off, thinking about governance and board governance and the dilemmas that they're facing, right? So ESG, when presented to boards of directors as an idea, right, they can latch onto that because of the selling point it offers them, right? They can latch onto it because of the margins it potentially creates for them. They can latch onto it because of the diversification it provides them. There's lots of reasons they might choose to latch on to that concept. And yet they also, as a board, are directing assets towards community work. They're also, as a board, directing assets to advocacy and lobbying work. And very, I mean, I don't have the stats on this one, but there's often two completely different paths for that, right? So we'll, for an example, we'll fund STEM in public schools. And at the same time, understanding that those children that are benefiting from STEM in public schools are the children of lowest wage workers, they will fight any minimum wage changes. And that's a very US-based context to offer, but that's an example of where, you know, the government can tell you when you can open that business, right? That's a regulatory and policy issue. The company can grow and be successful in that location. It can choose to latch on to certain great social ideas. And then at the same time, the interactions within that institutional setting are such that they're discriminatory, they're exclusionary, and at the same time, they're benefiting from social reputation by seeming to support important emerging initiatives like STEM in public schools or environmental cleanup.
Great. And then we have a couple questions from online as well. A question from Jan, who asks, how do you measure the value of environmental resources, and what are the benefits and risks of assigning economic value to these resources? And that's up for the whole panel as well. Mariana, maybe we want to start off with you.
Mariana, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Loretta. Yeah, that's a very important question. The value of environmental, you were talking about environmental services? How do you value?
Yeah, environmental resources. Yeah.
Okay. So in general, the valuing of environmental resources is a very difficult and very important topic because since we mostly get them for free, we take them for granted. So we tend to take them for granted, and the value is extremely important, so important that our life depends on it. So this is why all this topic about ESG and environmental social governance is so important, because through it we are covering every aspect of our society and what we need to survive and to maintain our planet. So all these policies and regulations are very important to work together with the public sector, with the private sector, with governments, with NGOs, with the communities, very important, with the local communities, and with the indigenous people. And there has to be a value put in the market for everything, all the environmental resources.
There's a indigenous leader in the United States who's also a biologist, Robin Kimmerman. She has a concept called the honorable harvest that comes from her indigenous tradition, and I apologize for not recalling which Native American communities she is a part of. But the honorable harvest, among its many principles, is the idea that you don't take the first one and you don't take the last one. And these are all values and concepts that grow out of the intimate relationship that Indigenous communities and her community have with the earth. And while we're talking about valuing and we're thinking about the economic models of valuing, I really just encourage folks to look up the Honorable Harvest. I think she's done a couple of talks online about it. And just really reflect on the ways in which those values that might seem very specific to earth relations can actually be really helpful in thinking about how we value economically these resources as well. Because we can value cobalt very highly, but that doesn't mean we value the countries and the very poor people whose job is to extract that from our earth, right? For an example.
Another way is also through ecosystem services. That there are right now currently around 300 programs in the world, and the important thing is also that there is a continuous international cooperation to pay for these ecosystem services, which are the local communities and Indigenous people are protecting our resources. And if we want to continue to make a sustainable use of them, we have to retribute these communities for this such an important work that they're doing, and that has to be through international cooperation. Yeah,
and one thing that I think I look at money as being hidden in plain sight, and so every community, every human in the world, in order for you to attain health, happiness, and stability, you need money to be able to pay for shelter, to pay for food, to operate. If you are operating a farm yourself and you're growing and agriculture. And so for me, it really starts with banking and Wall Street and policy, and that of course is biased based on the industry that I'm in. But in reality, I look at my parents who immigrated in 1976 from the Dominican Republic, and they were born under Trujillo, who was the dictator in the Dominican Republic and slaughtered thousands upon thousands of people based on the color of their skin. So when they came here with nothing and they were working in factories and mills and that some went up on fire, certainly it was looking at the reason that my parents were putting their own selves in harm's way, which that we're seeing now with healthcare workers and just people. It's you have to be able to pay for your space and just to exist, right? And so if we don't start looking at the banking institutions and the loans that are being issued that allow for these types of projects to even be created. So for instance, looking at ESG investments across the globe and providing access to water and housing to individuals that don't necessarily have access to it. So that's partnering with those public institutions that are trading on Wall Street to buy those resources. And a lot of it is modern day slavery, where these individuals are, Amazon hiring them to work from home or Facebook online and paying them, pennies. But then what they're saying is, oh, well, this allows for them to buy these cinder blocks to then build a home for themselves. And so then they're also issuing out loans. And so these are the types of deals that are coming through on a global scale. And these are investments that are held within all of these funds that are being tagged as ESG. And so it's something where, for me personally, I think in looking at the economic lens, it needs to start with policy. And if we want to talk about global, central banks, we talk about these swap lines that were created to allow for more banks around the world to just borrow in dollars, dollar-denominated debt. That means that you have to convert your own local currency to be able to make the payment in dollars. And so if you're dealing with high inflation and you're dealing with not enough food or impacts to the supply chain, and or corruption, which is the biggest thing for governments, where you have a bunch of your civilians are dying of starvation, but the government is living in a palace that's being funded by the loans that they're getting through the central bank, that's being further funded by other central banks, IMF, World Bank. So Argentina is a great example. We can look at Greece. So policy. So example where it's actionable is looking at terms. So in Greece, the prime minister had made an agreement, the president, that they would allow for approval for loans to be borrowed of $50 billion. So they have 4-year terms. So the first payment was due in 4.5 years.
Wow. All right, I think we have time for very quickly just one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up here. So this kind of dovetails back to some stuff that Loretta was saying on the last question, which is how can we empower Indigenous communities through sustainable finance?
I'll start because I think that Mariana is going to have a good thing to say. Because our panel focused broadly on race, social and environmental justice, whether it's Indigenous, which it should be always, and also when it includes marginalized communities within that local context. So here in New Hampshire, that would include our newest Americans. It would also include racial and gender non-conforming categories. And so kind of going back to that micro case example I offered of, anytime I'm thinking about a project or thinking about an investment, right, I'm looking at what's the local leadership who are most affected by the negative repercussions of these choices. What are they advocating for? And is this XYZ opportunity aligned with the reality that they face? Those are the deep probing questions, and you can ask that question across context, and you can scale that at a micro and then a macro level. But I think those are the kinds of questions that lead us to hold fund managers to account and say, that's great. I'm super excited about this different novel way of non-extractive energy. And also, can you tell me what the human harms are that you are incurring as you navigate this new innovation, right? And asking those questions directly, getting them on record, acknowledging that there are costs to whatever the innovation might be, and naming those costs, and then digging even further to see, okay, in those local communities where that is occurring, what is being advocated for? How can my decisions better support the real on-the-ground needs? And obviously it is about balance, right? We have to sustain ourselves, but that's true across societies and groups. And as we know, the Global South has borne the brunt of that reality for far, far too long, with great harm to our earth and to our societies. But I'm going to pass that over to Mariana.
I think you might be muted, Mariana.
I always forget, I'm sorry. Yeah, I would say that the best way to empower Indigenous communities is through incentives to enhance the provision of ecosystem services, and through the PES, the payment for ecosystem services, compensate these individuals, these communities, for their land use, for their resource management, for their decisions that influence the provision of these services, and for all the additional costs that they have for providing these services. So yeah, always incentives. So then we go back again to the importance of policies and regulations. We need every time more so that we can attract more financial resources to be able to pay for these incentives.
All right. Thank you everyone for the really vibrant discussion here. We're right at time, so I want to make sure that people have a chance to get, bio break, as Stephen says. And I want to thank you all for such a wonderfully engaging panel. I saw a number of questions come in from the audience about whether slides from all of your presentations would be posted up somewhere. Is that, it looked like that was, the answer to that was yes. And yeah, thank you all so much for this. I hope this has given everybody listening and everyone here a short reprieve from the endless news cycles, and that you can find a little bit of solace that, we have 3 people here who are doing really wonderful work. Thank you all for being on this.
Thank you very much, Colby.
And thank you very much, Colby, for moderating this panel. We're going to take a 4-minute break. Please take something to drink or whatever you need to do in those 4 minutes. The next session is going to be on the language of sustainability. And after that, we're going to have a break of 1 hour, because more than 3 sessions in a row are probably too much for anyone. And then we're going to have the fossil fuel divestment movement and breakouts at reflection and networking. So there's a lot more happening later on. Thank you very much to all the panelists. This was fascinating and really interesting conversation. Thank you, Colby, as well. Talk to you in a few minutes.